If you're seeing this, something inside you already knows the truth, and that truth is uncomfortable. You didn't arrive here by accident. A quiet fracture has formed beneath the surface of your certainty, a subtle tension between who you believe you are and what you are beginning to sense. This is not a breakdown. It is the first signal of awakening. The ego does not collapse loudly at first. It cracks softly through doubt, irritation, restlessness, and the strange feeling that your old explanations no longer work. What you are experiencing is not weakness. It is pressure from the deeper self demanding to be recognized. What follows is not a condemnation of the ego, but an invitation to understand it, because only what is understood can be transformed. The ego survives by telling stories, and for a long time these stories feel like truth itself. They tell you who you are, what you are worth, and how the world is supposed to respond to your efforts. They explain your past and predict your future. They whisper, if you do this, you will be safe. If you become that, you will be accepted. These narratives are not lies in the beginning. They are necessary structures. They help the child adapt, the student strive, the adult function. Without them, chaos would overwhelm consciousness. Yet every story the ego tells is partial, selective, and fragile, because it is built not on the totality of the psyche, but on what was rewarded, approved, and allowed to exist. For many years, these stories protect you. They help you endure hardship, push through fear, and carve an identity out of uncertainty. The diligent student becomes the successful professional. The agreeable child becomes the dependable caretaker. The disciplined achiever becomes the admired example. From the outside, this looks like success. From the inside, it feels like control. But the ego does not ask whether the story is true. It only asks whether it works. And eventually, life applies a pressure so great that the story begins to fail. This is often the moment that confuses people the most. Nothing is visibly wrong. The goals have been reached. The role has been fulfilled. Yet an emptiness appears where satisfaction was promised. The high achiever stands at the summit and feels strangely hollow, as if the view does not belong to them. The caretaker, who has given endlessly, feels unseen and quietly resentful, ashamed of emotions that contradict their self-image. These experiences are deeply unsettling because they threaten the ego's most sacred belief: if I do everything right, I will feel whole. Psychologically, this tension arises when lived experience no longer aligns with identity. The mind calls this cognitive dissonance, but at a deeper level, it is the soul protesting against a one-sided life. Research consistently shows that when people maintain identities that contradict their inner reality, the result is not fulfillment, but anxiety, burnout, and depression. Not because the person is weak, but because something untrue is being defended with enormous energy. The ego grows exhausted trying to maintain a story that no longer reflects the whole person. The crack begins quietly. It does not announce itself as transformation. It appears as irritation, restlessness, or a vague sense that something is missing. You may find yourself asking questions that feel dangerous. Why do I feel empty? Why doesn't this satisfy me anymore? Why am I angry when I have no reason to be? These questions terrify the ego because they expose the limits of its narrative. The ego depends on certainty. It needs clear rules and predictable rewards. When you ask, why isn't this enough? You are no longer asking how to succeed within the story. You are questioning the story itself. At this point, many people rush to repair the ego. They chase the next achievement, the next relationship, the next identity upgrade. They tell themselves they just need more discipline, more positivity, more gratitude. But these are often attempts to seal the crack rather than understand it. The psyche, however, does not create cracks by accident. When the ego's story collapses, it is because it can no longer contain the complexity of the person you are becoming. This moment is not a failure of character, it is a developmental necessity. Just as a child outgrows childish explanations of the world, the adult psyche eventually outgrows the stories that once ensured survival. The problem is that the ego resists this transition fiercely. It would rather repeat a familiar misery than face an unknown truth. Yet the pressure continues to build because what has been excluded from consciousness does not disappear. It waits. The ego cracks precisely when it has done its job too well. It has helped you adapt, succeed, and belong, but at the cost of authenticity. The hollow feeling at the peak, the resentment beneath generosity, the anxiety beneath competence. These are signals that the deeper layers of the psyche are demanding recognition. The story no longer protects you because it no longer represents you. And in that crack, uncomfortable as it is, something profoundly human begins to stir. The possibility of a life that is not merely successful, but whole. When the ego weakens, what it once kept in darkness begins to move toward the light. This is not an accident, nor is it a punishment. It is a psychological law. The ego is a gatekeeper, deciding what is acceptable to feel, think, and express. In order to function in society, it learns early which impulses bring approval and which bring rejection. Anger becomes unacceptable, fear becomes shameful, vulnerability becomes dangerous. These qualities are not destroyed, they are buried, and what is buried alive does not rest quietly. For a time, this repression appears to work. The person who calls themselves calm is praised. The one who is always positive is admired. The one who never complains is trusted. The ego proudly claims, "This is who I am." Yet beneath that identity, another reality forms. Every emotion denied becomes energy stored in the unconscious. Every impulse rejected becomes a shadow waiting for expression. The ego feels strong because it is narrow. It feels clean because it is incomplete. When the ego cracks, this carefully maintained order begins to dissolve. Traits long dissound start to surface, often in ways that feel sudden and disturbing. The endlessly agreeable person experiences unexpected rage. The optimist falls into despair. The disciplined achiever feels paralyzed by fear. These moments are often misinterpreted as regression or loss of control. In truth, they are signs of expansion. The psyche is demanding balance. Modern psychology confirms what inner experience has always shown. Emotions that are suppressed do not disappear. Research on emotional suppression demonstrates that ignored feelings intensify over time, often emerging as anxiety disorders, depression, psychosomatic illness, or explosive behavior. The ego insists, "That's not me." The deeper psyche responds, "It is part of you, whether you acknowledge it or not." The conflict is not between good and bad, but between what is known and what has been denied. This is why periods of inner crisis are often accompanied by vivid dreams, intrusive thoughts, or disproportionate emotional reactions. Dreams grow louder when waking consciousness refuses to listen. Thoughts become intrusive when they have been silenced for too long. Emotions overreact because they have been starving. The psyche compensates for one-sidedness. If consciousness insists on being light, the unconscious delivers darkness, not as punishment, but as correction. Many fear these emerging shadows because they confuse them with moral failure. They believe that anger makes them cruel, envy makes them ungrateful, fear makes them weak. But the shadow is not evil. It is simply unknown. It is the sum of what consciousness has not yet learned to hold. A person who has never acknowledged their anger is not peaceful. They are unconscious. A person who has never faced their fear is not brave. They are untested. The ego cracks because it cannot contain the full truth of the human psyche. It was never meant to. Its role is to orient, not to dominate. When it weakens, the shadow does not emerge to overthrow consciousness, but to complete it. Growth does not occur by eliminating darkness, but by making it visible. What is seen can be related to. What is related to can be transformed. Consider how often people project their shadow onto others. The traits they deny in themselves become unbearable when seen in someone else. The anger they refuse to feel becomes hatred toward the aggressive. The envy they suppress becomes contempt for the successful. The fear they deny becomes judgment of the cowardly. Projection is the ego's last defense against self-knowledge. When projection fails, the shadow turns inward and demands recognition. Listening to the shadow does not mean obeying every impulse. It means understanding its message. Anger may point to violated boundaries. Envy may reveal unlived potential. Fear may signal a life lived too far from truth. Vulnerability may indicate the need for connection rather than control. Each shadow emotion carries information the ego alone could never provide. The moment you stop fighting these emerging parts, something shifts. The inner war quiets. Energy once spent on repression becomes available for creativity, depth, and authenticity. You begin to feel more real, even when life is difficult. This is not because the darkness has vanished, but because it has been given a place in consciousness. The ego weakens not to humiliate you, but to mature you. The shadow emerges not to destroy you, but to teach you what wholeness requires. And the more honestly you face what you once rejected, the less power it has to control you from below. When the ego cracks, the first sensation is almost always loss. Something familiar disappears, and the mind rushes to name it failure. A relationship ends and the ego calls it rejection. A career collapses and the ego calls it wasted years. A personal crisis erupts and the ego calls it weakness. The pain feels undeniable, and yet what is being lost is rarely the self itself. What is being lost is an image, a structure, a certainty that once organized life. The ego grieves not because you are diminished, but because it can no longer rule in the way it once did. Human consciousness clings to orientation. It needs a map, even if the map is inaccurate. The ego provides this map by saying, "This is who I am, this is where I am going, and this is how I will be recognized." When that map dissolves, anxiety rushes in. The unfamiliar feels dangerous, not because it is wrong, but because it lacks definition. The psyche equates the unknown with annihilation. Yet history, psychology, and lived experience all point to the same truth: transformation begins in disorientation. Developmental psychology consistently shows that major identity shifts are preceded by periods of confusion and instability. Adolescence, midlife transitions, profound value changes, and spiritual awakenings all share this pattern. Old meanings collapse before new ones can form. The individual feels suspended between identities, no longer who they were, but not yet who they are becoming. This in-between state is deeply uncomfortable because the ego has nothing solid to grasp. It calls this emptiness a crisis. The psyche knows it as a reorganization. In these moments, people often say, "I feel lost." What they usually mean is, "I can no longer navigate life using my old self." Certainty disappears, routines lose their comfort, and goals that once motivated feel strangely hollow. But this loss of certainty is not the loss of direction. It is the loss of illusion. The illusion that identity is fixed. The illusion that worth is measured by roles. The illusion that meaning can be permanently secured through external forms. Consider the person who leaves a prestigious career after years of silent misery. From the outside, the decision appears irrational, even self-destructive. Friends question their sanity. Family worries about status and security. The ego itself panics, mourning the loss of recognition, structure, and control. Yet internally, the decision does not feel impulsive. It feels inevitable. Something deeper has grown intolerant of compromise. The psyche no longer accepts a life that contradicts its values. This inner necessity cannot be reasoned away. The ego may argue with numbers, expectations, and fear, but the deeper self speaks in feelings of suffocation and quiet despair. Staying becomes more painful than leaving. What looks like collapse is actually a turning. The old orientation no longer aligns with the inner compass. The crack becomes the only space through which realignment can occur. The ego experiences this shift as humiliation because it loses its familiar markers of success. Titles, routines, and external validation dissolve. Control weakens. Predictability vanishes. But the deeper self is not interested in maintaining appearances. It seeks coherence. It seeks a life that feels internally true, even if it appears uncertain from the outside. This is why such transitions feel both terrifying and strangely relieving at the same time. Many attempt to rush through this stage, desperate to regain certainty. They search for quick answers, new labels, or replacement identities. But reorientation cannot be forced. Just as the body needs time to heal after injury, The psyche needs time to reorganize after the collapse of an identity. Meaning does not emerge instantly. It gestates in silence, reflection, and patience. The feeling of loss is intensified because the ego mistakes orientation for identity. It believes that without a clear role, it does not exist. But identity is not erased in these moments. It is being restructured at a deeper level. You are not becoming less of yourself. You are becoming less of a persona. The persona was useful, but it was never the whole truth. Reorientation often begins subtly. Values shift. What once impressed no longer matters. What once felt optional becomes essential. The psyche recalibrates its priorities, not according to status, but according to meaning. This process cannot be rushed or fully understood while it is happening. It must be lived. The crack, then, is not the end of direction. It is the end of false direction. It is the space where the old map fails and a more honest one begins to form, one not drawn by fear or expectation, but by the quiet authority of the inner self that has waited patiently to be heard. When the ego cracks, suffering is not yet determined. What determines the depth and duration of the pain is resistance. The psyche always moves toward balance, but the ego clings to control. In that tension, distress is born. At this crossroads, there are only two possible movements, one toward unconscious reinforcement, the other toward awareness. One tightens the fracture until it becomes torment. The other opens it into transformation. The ego's instinct is to defend itself. When its certainty is threatened, it reaches for distraction, denial, and blame. It seeks noise to drown out discomfort and speed to outrun reflection. In the modern world, these defenses are everywhere. Endless productivity masks inner emptiness. Constant stimulation replaces silence. Validation becomes currency. Social comparison offers momentary relief by saying, "At least I am doing better than someone else." These behaviors feel productive, even virtuous, but they often serve a single purpose: to avoid being alone with oneself. Mental health research repeatedly shows that avoidance coping strategies may reduce discomfort in the short term, but they increase psychological distress over time. Anxiety deepens when it is outrun. Depression grows when it is denied. The ego believes it is protecting the self, but in reality, it is preventing the psyche from completing its necessary work. What is not faced does not fade, it waits. Resistance intensifies the crack because it turns a natural transition into an internal war. The ego fights to preserve an identity that no longer fits, while the deeper self pushes for expansion. This conflict drains energy and creates the feeling of being stuck, restless, or chronically dissatisfied. Life begins to feel heavy, even when nothing appears wrong on the surface. The ego insists on returning to how things were. The psyche insists on moving forward. Yet, when awareness enters the process, something remarkable occurs. The same pain that felt chaotic begins to organize itself. Those who turn inward rather than outward experience this shift. Through reflection, journaling, therapy, or honest conversation, they create a space where thoughts and emotions can be observed instead of immediately acted upon or suppressed. In this space, suffering gains meaning. Awareness introduces distance. Instead of saying, "I am anxious," one begins to notice anxiety is present. Instead of, "I am failing," it becomes, "There is a fear of failure moving through me." This subtle shift changes everything. The individual is no longer fused with the content of the psyche. They become the witness rather than the battlefield. This is not detachment in the sense of indifference. It is engagement without possession. This is the moment when identity quietly transforms. The person who once defined themselves by roles, achievements, or approval begins to sense a deeper center. They realize they are not identical with their job, their productivity, or even their emotional states. They are the awareness in which these experiences arise. This recognition does not inflate the ego, it humbles it. The ego is no longer the ruler of the psyche, but one function among many. Importantly, awareness does not destroy the ego. The ego is necessary for navigation, decision-making, and participation in the world. What awareness does is dethrone it. The ego steps down from absolute authority, and takes its rightful place as a servant rather than a master. In this rebalancing, inner conflict softens. The psyche no longer needs to shout through symptoms because it is finally being heard. People often fear that turning inward will make them self-absorbed or weak. In reality, the opposite occurs. Those who develop awareness become more grounded, not less. They react less compulsively, listen more deeply, and act with greater intentionality. They are no longer driven by unconscious patterns seeking relief, but guided by a growing sense of inner coherence. The crack becomes transformative when it is met with curiosity rather than control. Pain becomes a message rather than an enemy. Confusion becomes a signal rather than a verdict. Life no longer feels like something happening to you, but something unfolding through you. This does not remove difficulty, but it removes the unnecessary suffering created by resistance. In this way, awareness restores balance. It allows the ego to relax its grip and the deeper self to participate consciously in life. The fracture that once felt threatening becomes an opening, one that leads not to collapse, but to a more integrated, conscious, and authentic way of being. When the ego cracks, many fear that order will dissolve and life will descend into chaos. Yet the true purpose of this rupture is not destruction, but wholeness. The ego was never meant to carry the entire weight of the psyche. Its task was to help you adapt, to protect you while consciousness formed. But when it remains unchallenged, it begins to rule rather than serve. Life then becomes organized around approval, safety, and image. Choices are made not from inner truth, but from fear of rejection and the hunger to be seen. The crack appears precisely because something deeper refuses to live this way any longer. A life driven solely by the ego is busy, impressive, and often deeply unsatisfying. It is filled with achievements that do not nourish and relationships that remain surface level. The ego measures success by visibility and control. It asks, how am I perceived? And am I secure? The deeper self asks different questions. Is this meaningful? And is this true? When these two centers are out of alignment, the psyche suffers quietly until it can no longer endure the contradiction. The cracking of the ego marks the beginning of individuation, the movement toward becoming a whole, differentiated human being rather than a collection of roles and reactions. Individuation does not mean withdrawing from society or rejecting responsibility. It means engaging with the world from an inner center that is no longer dictated by unconscious fear or imitation. The individual becomes less concerned with fitting in and more concerned with being real. Those who pass through this process often describe similar changes, even though their lives may look very different on the surface. Relationships become fewer, but deeper. There is less tolerance for pretense and more capacity for genuine connection. Conversations shift from performance to presence. The need to be liked softens, replaced by the need to be honest. This can feel lonely at first, because individuation separates what is essential from what is merely habitual. Yet what remains carries a depth that superficial connections never could. Work, too, undergoes a transformation. Instead of being driven solely by ambition or security, it begins to align with values. This does not always mean dramatic career changes, but it does mean a different relationship to effort and success. Work becomes an expression of inner coherence, rather than a compensation for inner emptiness. People report feeling less frantic, even when they are working hard, because their actions are no longer at war with their values. Confidence also changes its nature. The loud confidence of the ego, which depends on comparison and validation, gives way to something quieter and more stable. This confidence does not need to announce itself. It is rooted in self-trust rather than approval. The individual no longer feels the need to constantly prove their worth, because worth is no longer in question. This inner stability is one of the most consistent outcomes reported by those who have undergone deep psychological integration. Research on long-term well-being supports this inner experience. Longitudinal studies repeatedly show that meaning is a stronger predictor of life satisfaction than pleasure, wealth, or status. Pleasure fades quickly. Status demands constant maintenance. Meaning endures because it is connected to values, purpose, and contribution. When the ego cracks, it loosens its grip on external rewards, allowing the psyche to orient itself around what genuinely matters. This does not make life easier in a superficial sense. Individuation requires responsibility. It demands that you take ownership of your choices rather than hiding behind expectations or roles. It requires facing your limitations as well as your potential. But this responsibility is not oppressive, it is liberating. You are no longer living someone else's life or chasing someone else's definition of success. It is important to understand that this process does not eliminate the ego. The ego is not an enemy to be destroyed. It is a tool to be refined. It once served you by helping you survive, belong, and function. Now it must learn a new role to cooperate with the deeper self rather than dominate it. When the ego listens instead of commands, it becomes flexible, realistic, and humane. You are not becoming less functional as the ego loosens its control. You are becoming more integrated. Fragmented energy returns. Inner conflicts soften. Life feels less like a performance and more like an expression. The crack that once felt threatening reveals itself as a doorway, one that leads not away from the world, but into it more fully, with a self that is finally aligned from within. If you're seeing this, your ego is already cracking, and that is not a threat. It is an invitation. The question is not how to fix the crack, but how to step through it consciously. On the other side is not perfection, but authenticity. Not certainty, but depth. And not the loss of self, but the discovery of one that is finally whole.